Greetings and salutations. Today we are delving into the tragic tale of the Branch Davidian cult from Waco, Texas, who was involved in the 51-day showdown with the federal government. And this is a story which is rife with conspiracy theories. Now, when it comes to the Waco siege, opinions are all over the place. It's a mess, really. Much like the siege itself, where some people believe it was all about a loony cult, much like Om Shinrikyo, and a devoted crew of doomsday cultists. Others argue that it was a brutal massacre orchestrated by a government agency which has, on multiple occasions, shown itself to have gone rogue. But what's the truth? It may lie somewhere in the middle. Either way, no one can deny that the Waco siege left a scar on law enforcement's history, one that even reverberated recently. It's one of those events which has sparked mistrust and animosity even decades later. Starting with the Branch Davidians, who are actually a group who has ties to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And back when they were part of the church, this group, or a significant section of the church itself, would diverge, leading to a significant schism that caused the breakup. And that all goes back to the 1920s, when a man by the name of Victor Houteff would make waves in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And while the Seventh-day Adventists might have a particular focus on the Book of Revelations, Victor, he would focus on it to an extreme, focusing on things like the chosen ones and other segments of symbology, taking it literally rather than figuratively, or even prophetically, which would lead to him creating a manuscript by the name of the Shepherd's Rod, in which he claimed to have cracked the secret code hidden within Revelations. And this seemed to catch on rather quickly within a significant section of the church. However, the leadership and the majority of the church were not quite copacetic with what he was preaching. And after he had come on a bit too strong and attempted to diverge the church's structure in its entirety, they kicked him out. And from there, the origins of the Branch Davidians as their own independent entity were wrought. But it would not be until 1934 that Victor would officially begin his own religion. But this would not be the Branch Davidians. He would call this group the Shepherd's Rod. However, despite Victor's naming of the group as the Shepherd's Rod, they began to call themselves the Davidians. Sometime later, in 1935, the Davidians would purchase a plot of land just outside of Waco, Texas, which they dubbed Mount Carmel, named after the story of Prophet Elijah, which unintentionally seems somewhat prophetic. Now, originally there were only 125 individuals who resided in Mount Carmel. However, the number would continue to grow at a steady rate. Mount Carmel would develop from an individual homestead with a church and a few families to what at the time would be seen as potentially an extremely small town, due to including farming, gardens, schools, and even healthcare facilities. Now, not being tied to the Seventh-day Adventists, it seems Victor's religious beliefs would begin to spread like wildfire, and the Davidians grew well over 50,000 strong. In fact, they would reach numbers comparable to those of the followers of Zoroastrianism. However, things would begin to change when Benjamin Rodan would come into this story, and he would create his own interpretation of the scripture provided by Victor, and that adhered to by the Davidians. And it seemed to begin to subsume Victor's own religion, especially after Victor would pass in 1955. And this is where Florence Houteff took the reins of the religious sect. Now, it must be noted that Benjamin and Florence did not see eye to eye. In part, this was because it seems that Benjamin believed that scripture was a living, evolving document, much like the Constitution is a living, evolving document. And he would go on to claim that God, or as he would go on to call it, the branch, was giving him fresh insight into scripture and new religious tenets. So eventually, he and a group would form off a branch that would break off from the Davidians, and fittingly enough, they would call themselves the Branch Davidians. However, things would not end there. Florence at the time would still hold the reins of the original Davidian sect. Like many groups focused on the end times, she would drop a prediction that the world was going to end in April 22nd, 1959. And like many religions who claim that the end times would come in a specific date within the lifetime of the followers, things did not go all too well. This claim of an apocalypse, which did not happen, caused a rift within the remaining devout Davidian group, and caused Florence to lose grip on her power and essentially be deposed, as Benjamin would come in with his group of Branch Davidians and gain control of Mount Carmel and the operations therein, essentially subsuming the group of Davidians that was left. However, at this point, the group had decreased to around 100 members, give or take. Later, when Benjamin would pass in 1978, his wife Lois would take control. However, things would become far more interesting in 1981 when a man by the name of Vernon Howell would enter the scene. And to those who knew him, Vernon was said to be a great speaker and incredibly charming, all the while claiming to have his own personal hotline to God, in a way quite reminiscent to Benjamin. And such a figure seemed to be perfect for the leadership of the Branch Davidians, and it seemed he was just Lois's type, which led to a relationship and what in all intents and purposes was a prediction that their love child would be some messianic chosen one. However, Lois's first son, George, was not the happiest camper in this situation, and it is well known that he did not only think that Vernon was teaching things which were quite literally insane by his account, how he had been involved with his mother seemed to rub him the wrong way. So in 1983, George would take charge, and one of George's first moves was essentially deplatforming Vernon and removing his quite honestly divergent teachings from circulation within the Branch Davidians. And for a while this seemed fine. While not perfect, and Vernon and George were noted to have a rather awkward relationship, they were able to collaborate and maintain Mount Carmel. At this point, tensions would begin to build, and eventually a fire would break out in 1984, which would lead to George pointing an accusatory finger at Vernon, who, and I kid you not, would say something along the lines of, "Hey, maybe God did it," and it would lead to Vernon being kicked out at gunpoint, eventually leading to him setting off elsewhere, while George went on to rebuild Mount Carmel under the name Rodenville. But this was not the final showdown between George and Vernon, leading to a back and forth which would reach its boiling point in 1987, where Vernon would decide to pay a visit to the old Mount Carmel site, now Rodenville. And here is where witnesses claim that George had dug up the body of a deceased Davidian from a few decades earlier, stating that he was just moving the bodies and that there was nothing openly suspicious. However, where things got really out of hand was where George challenged Vernon to a downright bizarre competition, one where they both would attempt to raise the dead. Now the question whether they were delusional or it was some type of 4D chess move that backfired can't really be answered. However, before things would escalate even further between the two into a physical confrontation, Vernon would go to the cops, accusing George of corpse defilement. Now, while the sheriff's department would not be able to do much without physical evidence, Vernon would not let things go. So, in November 1987, he would go armed to the teeth and storm Rodenville, claiming that he and his crew were just gathering evidence. However, none too surprisingly, George wasn't having it, which led to a shootout. Half an hour later and the cops would finally show up. There were no casualties, however, Vernon had been shot, but he was successfully able to spin a tale of self-defense, claiming that he was just firing warning shots. Even though you're not allowed to fire warning shots, somehow that seemed to work. And it was just another strange chapter in the Branch Davidian's tale. And much to mine and anybody else's surprise, Vernon got away scot-free, but not because he was implicitly innocent, but because of a mistrial, where members of the jury would actually go on to hug Vernon afterwards. In contrast to Vernon, things for George had gone rather bottoms up, and he was hit with contempt charges, leading him to spend some time behind bars. However, things would go from bad to worse for George when he found out a notable number of his followers had actually switched sides and were now devotees of Vernon, leading him to a fit of paranoia which caused him to take an axe to some of his followers, leading him to be locked up for murder and opening the doors for Vernon to waltz right back into Rodenville and rename it to Mount Carmel, taking control of the entire facility almost as if out of some Machiavellian plot. With George out of the picture, Vernon would seize control of the facility and all the followers. But that was not enough. He would redub himself David Koresh, alluding to a connection to King David, and with that, David Koresh would launch himself into his own iteration of the Book of Revelations. Where he would differ is he would focus on the return of the Lamb of God, and how he was key in this. According to him, the Lamb of God mentioned in Revelations wasn't Jesus, but a whole independent entity. And much like the leader of Om Shinrikyo, he believed that Christ was not an exclusive title to Jesus. In his teachings, David would tell his followers that they were destined to battle the armies of Babylon during the end times, and while some saw him as the Son of God and the proverbial Lamb of God, others in his flock weren't so sure. However, that is beside the point. Where things get rather interesting is the Waco incident seems to be somewhat of early media sensationalism mixed with misinterpreted information, as while most outlets painted David as a megalomaniac supervillain who would twirl his mustache while using the word of God to pervert his followers into acts of vile debauchery and outright evil, the Branch Davidians, or in particular the iteration of them which followed Koresh, were not a death cult in any way, shape, or form. They were not even believed to be outright violent by any of those residing in the area. In fact, they saw it as their duty, as the incarnations of the Lamb of God, to hold out defensively until the bitter end, not to be aggressors in any way, shape, or form. And this was clearly stated in their religious rhetoric and practices. While they may be considered weird, strange, or unlikable, almost the entirety of their belief seemed like they were just doomsday preppers getting ready for the apocalypse. However, where things would get into the mire would be when people investigated how David Koresh thought and functioned, and he firmly believed that he was called to assemble an army, gearing up for war, but not to be aggressors. In this scenario, which he believed was not hypothetical at all, the fact that the Branch Davidians had been given rise to in America was only natural. Drawing on biblical examples, he justified his stance, in particular pointing once more to the group's namesake, King David, and his warriors, also making reference to Jesus and his disciples who were in and of themselves armed. So eventually in 1989, another incident which has lended credence into the belief that David was somewhat of a despotic cult leader would occur. He would go on to claim, in classical cult leader fashion, that he had gotten a revelation, that he had to father 24 children who would become leaders in the apocalypse. Now, this isn't uncommon within cults. In particular, many cult leaders, such as Jim Jones, structured segments of his religion in order to have reproductive control of it proper, which would further reinforce his control within the group. The same would follow with Shoko Asahara, the leader of Om Shinrikyo. Some of this may derive from his early childhood. Being sired by a 14-year-old mother led David to be raised by his grandparents, all the while dealing with notable learning disabilities, leading to severe ridicule throughout his school life and potential ostracization from the opposite gender. And while this does not excuse him, one could see where his behavior would come from. And let's be clear about this. The Waco siege is not a pure good and evil story. Because while the Branch Davidians were indeed victims, it is important to recognize David Koresh's role in everything, and he did in fact do terrible things, all the while believing in his cause being true. And while they lend a potential explanation for why he did it, his upbringing and early life experiences should not and must not be considered as a means to absolve him of his crimes, only to offer insight into why and how he did things. During his youth, he would find solace within religion, all throughout his life claiming to receive divine revelations. And at 19, he seemed to take particular parts of biblical tales too seriously when he took a bold move and addressed a pastor, telling him that God had ordained his daughter be wed to David himself. His very underage daughter, mind you. And when he was rejected by the pastor, and rightfully so, he would not stop, as he would persist and pursue the girl, eventually impregnating her, which led to the church ostracizing him and kicking him out, following a trend that seems to unfortunately follow the Davidians. Now, I can't be certain if this one child was to be counted amongst the 24 that he was supposedly to have, or if they were to be 24 new ones. Being ousted led him to travel to countries like Israel and much of Europe, all the while recruiting individuals for his prophetic cause. During this period, David claimed to receive guidance and essentially claim that God had directed him to marry yet another young woman. Now mind you, she was also significantly underage. Now here's the rather nasty part. It seemed at least one of the girls that David had attempted to marry had been 14 at the time that he was 29. And it seems he had a preference for girls of the younger persuasion much like her, which eventually would escalate, leading to former members of the Branch Davidians speaking out, alleging severe cases of child abuse within the compound. And while it is true that David's relationship with a younger woman, one that in large swaths of the country would have been considered underaged, it is important to note that at the time, under Texas law, it was legal. However, these allegations would morph into stories of widespread abuse within the church, not being limited to the girl who was of legal age within Texas. This would paint the Branch Davidians as depraved sycophants and predators. It would not be until Mark, after his removal from the church by David, reached out to various international agencies, all the while making damning allegations and claims against David Koresh, that temperatures would begin to rise, and the ball for the tragedy that was the Waco siege would begin to roll. In 1992, Bordeaux saw an opportunity for retribution, in particular when a man by the name of David Jewell had become entangled in a custody dispute with his wife, Shirley Jewell, who was a Branch Davidian member residing at Mount Carmel. Bordeaux would approach David Jewell's mother and divulge tales of the abuse and weapon stockpiling which he claimed had occurred within the Branch Davidians community. From an outsider's perspective, these accusations were rather damning and painted a grim picture. However, outside of the potentially slanderous tales of sexual abuse, the Branch Davidians' overall lifestyle, including the weapons, was not out of the norm. Despite David Koresh's unusual beliefs and unscrupulous personal behavior, the Davidians maintained a surprisingly normal existence, contrary to the expectations of many, and in stark contrast to the more sensational news reports. Members would not be confined to the compounds, as they were allowed to freely roam. They even owned vehicles which they were allowed to take wherever they wanted. They even held jobs in the town, and enjoyed and took part in recreational activities, not just within Waco, but without. David himself was part of a band that performed in a myriad of local venues. Movie nights at Mount Carmel were a regular occurrence, and non-members were allowed to freely roam within these parts. They even hosted ice cream socials and a myriad of other community events, all the while joining in festivities that happened around the area. The Branch Davidians themselves were actually noted to be rather integrated and involved in the Waco community proper, fostering an open-door policy where they welcomed all visitors, including state and federal agents, whether they wanted to observe, engage in their teachings, or simply socialize with the members. Some even joined the community after being drawn in by the group's inclusive and welcoming attitudes. It must be noted that when child abuse allegations surfaced, it would send shockwaves throughout the community and the town proper. In 1992, Child Protective Services would launch an investigation into the Branch Davidians themselves to probe the validity of the claims made. Simultaneously, an Australian news channel would go to visit Mount Carmel and interviewed David Koresh in an attempt to shed light on the Branch Davidians community. After a thorough investigation, where it seems the Branch Davidians and David Koresh himself were stringently observed, it was found that there was insufficient evidence to substantiate the claims of child abuse, leading this case to be closed. However, despite the assertions of CPS and the lack of evidence, this incident caused a severe tarnishing of the once sparklingly positive public image of the Branch Davidians, leading to a gradual shift in public opinion around them. Eventually, efforts would be made to gather more information, just in case, including interviews by the Department of Human Services. However, still, there was no evidence found which could be used to build a case against David Koresh or any other individuals who were current members of the Branch Davidians, in particular for child abuse. Yet the claims of this said abuse would remain in the media, and in particular regarding allegations of sexual misconduct with underage children, in particular girls. David Koresh would deny any allegations of this. Now, this could be genuinely because of a misunderstanding of the difference between ages of consent between states, or it could be because it did bring a lot of attention to the media reports. Either way, the media would continue to report this, regardless of them being cleared. And while David would say he had relations with some of the women in the group, he would affirm that it was consensual and none of them were minors. Now, something else that seemed to get the media all prickly was the Branch Davidians' affinity for firearms, which, while not uncommon in Texas, might not have been the most positively viewed within certain circles from a more national stage. In particular, David Koresh had been known to invite members of the community and the surrounding region to shoot various weapons that the Branch Davidians had amassed. However, during subsequent investigations and trials, it seemed misinformation, intentional or otherwise, seemed to be circulated regarding these firearms. In particular, information about something mag bags. This was a business operated legally by a Branch Davidian member, which is claimed to have been tied, once again legally, to an FFL, or a federal firearms license dealer, which is an individual who has a licensing from the federal government for legal gun sales, manufacturing, and to do background checks, whether they be an individual or a brick and mortar gun shop. And it seems it was tied to Paul Feda, a member of the Branch Davidians who was an FFL and who used this as his legitimate source of income, as it was noted that he would attend local gun shows and legally follow the procedures necessary to sell firearms. And while some of the media even to this day would claim that you just trade money for a gun at a gun shop, there are procedures that must be followed, including the documentation of the gun that is sold and the background checks, as required by law. However, the verbiage used to vilify the group would further be applied more strictly to Feda's legal business, known as bag, painting it to be something more sinister, akin to the gun running that was eventually done by the federal government's Operation Fast and Furious. But in reality, it was a fully lawful business, who seemed to strictly follow the rules. And part of what raised eyebrows was the stockpiling of weapon parts, which, while may seem uncommon to many, in particular in some more urban areas, is not uncommon for firearms dealers to do, since they are allowed to build the firearms and sell them as such. Now, what raised suspicions on this business was in particular a UPS worker reporting to the police in February 1992, where he would state that while delivering a package to Magbag, he had allegedly saw training grenades and black powder amongst the gun components. Now, while these items may be unusual in some areas, in some places you can buy desk lamps that are made out of old decommissioned grenades. And plenty of people hunt using black powder or reload their own bullets using black powder. So these being found at a gun shop, especially back in the 90s, is not something that would be out of the norm. This report by the UPS worker would prompt an investigation by the local sheriff's department, who would alert the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, all the while working in conjunction with the IRS. And while owning certain fully automatic firearm parts are legal, they do require a $200 tax stamp. This tax stamp and the inclusion of the IRS was there to dissuade the transfer, legal though it may be, of the firearm. However, while the items being delivered to the gun shop tied to the Branch Davidians were legal, it seemed the dummy grenades and black powder being purchased set off alarm bells in the ATF, due to, in certain circumstances, potentially being used to make untaxed explosives, and the untaxed part seems to be the more important part. Their investigation into the group would begin on June 9th, 1992, and by July 30th of that same year, 2 agents were sent to a local gun shop in order to dig into the Davidians' background. However, surprisingly enough for the ATF, the shop vouched for them, even though not being directly tied to the Branch Davidians. It seems that on every level, the Branch Davidians were rather upfront, even trading their weapons into the gun shop every once in a while. However, it seemed that the ATF did not take their word for it, and decided to go further. They would have a talk within the sheriff's office between themselves, the local authorities, and David Koresh, where Koresh would openly invite them to check out their paperwork and weapons, firmly stating that everything was above board. However, for reasons bizarre and in and of themselves, the ATF turned this down, when honestly you'd think that they would take this opportunity when they were openly invited and had every legal right to check basically everything from top to bottom. You have to ask yourself, why would they turn it down? Well, anyway, after that, the ATF would decide to act like the CIA, honestly in the long run making a fool out of themselves by renting a house across from Mount Carmel, would do the old Hollywood thing and pretend to be in their teens and early 20s, and using a constant cover of wet toilet paper or other mundane issues to attempt to sneak into a facility that they had originally been invited in completely openly, and when that same facility was one where they had an open door policy to anybody who wanted to come. Almost every single individual who had observed them was rather clear that they were glowers, and definitely not college-aged. Agent Robert Rodriguez would even go as far as to attempt to sneak into the sermons and covertly observe, and this was so dumb and so clear and blatant that David Koresh and near everyone around saw through it almost immediately. But they weren't bothered since, well, they had an open door policy, and they had already told the ATF that they could check whatever they wanted. It was no problem. And Rodriguez would go on to report back some rather interesting findings. He had claimed that he had seen lower receiver parts, which are legal, aluminum blocks, which are legal, and fake grenades, which once again are legal. And when he was referring to lower receiver parts, he was making reference to things such as a lower for an AR-15, which, being rather modular, you can take the parts out to fix them, clean them, or replace them, or even just buy spares in case they break. Most preppers have spare parts just in case they break or something goes wrong, so that is completely not out of the norm. And it's not like the Branch Davidians had been even out of the norm, since buying lower receiver parts and assembling the rifles in and of themselves was a known hobby of the Branch Davidians, and actually a popular hobby to this day across the United States, and completely above the board and legal. They would also sell them at gun shows, which again was legal and not out of the norm, and the ATF should know this. So I honestly find myself completely befuddled when supposed firearms experts of the ATF saw completely legal parts in a completely legal setting and freaked out. The ATF would completely spaz out at this, and while it was known that the Branch Davidians had never been ones to alter the receiver itself or do any of the modifications or even have the equipment to do the modifications to turn legal semi-automatic firearms into fully automatic ones, the ATF decided to label them as potential criminals, like tying a farmer who has manure and propane to the Unabomber. It's just silly. This would lead the ATF to decide to raid Mount Carmel because they got a report from one very silly ATF agent who attempted to sneak into a place that he was invited into openly and classified legal gun parts as something terrible and dangerous. And while it is true that the law states that you cannot have gun parts with the intent to make them into illegal firearms, things get a little dicey, as records would show that the ATF's search warrant was based on the idea that just because the Davidians had the possession of the parts, that their intent was to somehow, without the facilities or the fabrication equipment, to make illegal firearms. However, digging even further into things, the incompetence of the ATF seems to be just flagrant. In particular, they would mention AK-47 receivers being separately put together by hand without the equipment, but anybody who understands how an AK is made would tell you you cannot just put together an AK without the equipment, parts, or training like you can with an AR-15. So right off the bat, things are not looking very good for the case of the ATF. And even worse, they make reference to an AK lower receiver, which isn't a thing. They just have a receiver. There is no lower. This means there is a key misunderstanding of the firearm they claim to have seen. There are also claims of a local making noise complaints of automatic gunfire. However, this had been checked out by the local police department, and it was just found that they were mag dumping, which is just pulling the trigger really fast and dumping it into a wall, into an already decommissioned vehicle, or literally just shooting really quick into trash. However, the ATF would decide to either conveniently leave this out, or they were so incompetent that they completely forgot about it and just listed it as evidence of there being automatic gunfire and unregistered machine guns being in the possession of the Davidians. And they would even use the former reports and claims of child abuse as a rationale for their actions against the Davidians, in spite of CPS having already looked into it, essentially stating nothing was found. There's also claims of a meth lab being somewhere on the property, and while this one did exist, the reason anybody knew it was because it had been illegally placed within the property by somebody else, and David Koresh himself had called the police department for them to deal with it and eliminate it from his property. So in essence, the ATF had little to no justification for anything, and were either incompetent or flagrantly ignoring information that would clear the Branch Davidians and invalidate their investigation. At this point, they really seemed trigger happy, looking for any justification for a raid. Now, the rationale as to why they might want to commit this raid and paint the Davidians as these vile monsters who are committing a myriad of crimes, stocking up a large amount of illegal firearms and explosives, drugs, and anything else that could be used to make them seem as villains, was likely in large part due to the ATF's constant publicity failings. In particular, the recent events of Ruby Ridge, where the ATF had made a real bad name for themselves. Where in August of 1992, the ATF was investigating an individual by the name of Randy Weber, who they had believed had chopped the barrels off his firearms, in particular shotguns, which would make it an NFA item, in particular an SBS, short-barreled shotgun, and that would be a felony. And when the ATF had heard about what Randy had supposedly done, they had set up a court date for him. However, just because they set up a court date does not mean that they had informed him properly, since Randy had missed said court date in part due to living off the grid and not checking his mail as often as somebody who lived on the grid would, leading to some rather negative issues. In particular, one night in August, US Marshals going so far as to show up on his place known as Ruby Ridge in order to arrest him. And here's where things get really bad, and the ATF starts to get some of its more infamous identity from. When they had got there, under the ATF's authority, Randy's dog started to bark at them. And while the ATF is known for killing dogs at the first chance they get for a reason, and they fired, and they not only got the dog, but they got Randy's son and killed him, which Randy took umbrage at, which led to the death of the agent, leading to a 2-week standoff where negotiators, and this is openly known, were fed rather false information or outright misinformation, leading everything to go as bad as it could. Then, to make matters worse for the public image of the authorities, one of their snipers, Lon Haruchi, had started shooting at Randy as he was walking out of his shed, or so he claims, and one of the shots would strike Randy's unarmed wife, who at the time was with her children, and killed her. Now, I don't know you, but a kid does not look like a gun or a weapon, and this led to things getting worse. Eventually, Randy surrendering to the FBI in fear for his children's life, since they'd already killed his son, they took his dog, and by any other interpretation, murdered his unarmed wife. Long story short, the Ruby Ridge debacle left a really bad taste in people's mouths. And at the time, the ATF was viewed as public enemy number one, with a myriad of calls for the agency to be completely scuttled, eliminated, and all their agents fired, especially when those involved were not really punished in any way, shape, or form other than a slap on the wrist. It seems, in an effort to make themselves viewed as necessary and integral to the continuation of decent society within the United States, the ATF wanted an incident, one which would make them look good rather than a debacle like Ruby Ridge. And amidst the kerfuffle, the ATF got wind of a group who had been claimed to have been abusing kids and potentially been holding some illegal weapons, and they took this as casus belli to act in a manner that would make them look good. And while this may not be the official stance of the government, many involved with the case, or that were tied to it, seem to hold this view as a prevailing stance. Where things get rather interesting was the siege itself, since it is claimed that David Koresh was one of the main targets, or if not, the primary target. Yet the ATF had individuals who had been watching him constantly, and it was noted that he was not within the facilities 24/7, meaning they could have just grabbed him at any point, which seems to lend credence to the idea that they wanted a big raid, something massive, eye-catching, which would validate the necessity for their agency's continued existence. And this is not to understate or to minimize the fact that David Koresh was anything but a saint. He was pretty shady, if anything, and personally not my cup of tea. But the way the ATF was acting, things would not make logical sense if what they were saying they wanted to do was in fact what they wanted to do, at least to significant swaths of the population. So rather than grabbing their main target and going about their merry way, having stopped what they had claimed to be this potentially violent cult leader who was abusing children, they instead decided to wait until he was back within the facility in order to storm a place filled with children. And the day before everything went just horribly for everyone, the Waco Tribune-Herald would drop a news report by the name of The Sinful Messiah, which essentially parroted the points verbatim that the ATF had been making, or attempting to make, in a manner that was rather suspicious to those who were observing it at a later date, and this was published on February the 27th. In a rather bold move, as it seems this was an attempt to give the FBI cash to belly for their actions right before the raid, but it seems that ATF wasn't quite too happy about it. I mean, the way it was reported, it all but stated that the Branch Davidians were going to be raided, and while they were definitely not the most covert group, as the ATF agent who had attempted to be sneaky had proven, later the ATF would attempt to claim that they had moved up the raid because of the report, despite having all the equipment set up and ready, and February 28th being a deadline that later would be found out that they had created for themselves previously, and the fact that it was known that they had been running drills in a military facility and information had already been leaked out to those who owned the military facility about the date that they were intending to conduct the Waco siege. What a myriad of individuals have found suspicious was, if this was just a search warrant and not anything else, why had they been training in the way that they had, even though they had been invited on multiple occasions and been allowed in to Mount Carmel to search it at their leisure. But instead, for some reason that is far beyond me, they had set up what amounted to as a military operation, and by all appearances seemed to want to instigate a confrontation, not just execute the search warrant. This was quite literally something that could have been prevented by just going to Mount Carmel and taking up Koresh's offer to check the place out months prior. However, for some reason, the ATF decided to go guns blazing, almost as if they had been pushed into a corner and were on the verge of being unmade by the government. Which quite honestly is a scary thing if you have messed up so badly that the federal government is even considering getting rid of a 3-letter agency. So in the early hours of February 28, 1993, the tumultuous Waco siege would be kicked off. And it seemed that the ATF was incompetent in even keeping the media out of things, since a local reporter got wind of things that were about to go down, in particular with the ATF group that everybody knew was in the area, leading to the reporter asking a postman for directions to the Branch Davidian's compound, and he informed them of what was going to happen. But little did the reporter know that the postman he had stopped and questioned was David Koresh's brother-in-law, who was coincidentally also a Branch Davidian. Koresh's brother-in-law wasted no time as he jumped in his car and sped towards the compound, giving everybody a heads up on the impending raid and how apparently militarized it was. This painted a horrible picture, causing panic to start to break out amongst the Branch Davidians. Koresh would even go so far as to rush to Agent Rodriguez, who still believed, beyond all comprehension, that he was secretly undercover. Koresh pleaded with him, stating that there were women and children who were completely uninvolved and would be in harm's way. However, the brave and noble Rodriguez decided to play dumb and run away. Now, I don't know if the ATF was decided to play commando or something, but they didn't show up as normally they would. No, they had written down their blood types and were wearing military gear and had their personal information written on their necks and their wrists in case, I don't know, their heads got blown off or something, or in case they needed a transfusion, and they were bringing in a veritable army. However, inside Mount Carmel, there were about, at maximum, 115 people, maybe a few less, and quickly the women and children were made to hide out in their rooms for safety, because the federal government would never clearly attack children's rooms and unarmed women, while some of the men would go form a perimeter around the main structure with their own firearms. Koresh and others within the group were figuring, and rightfully so, that the ATF would be attempting to go in guns a-blazing in an attempt to lay down the law and mow down anybody who got in their way. And while not explicitly right, since the ATF had never claimed they wanted to do that, actions spoke louder than words. And seeing as, well, the Branch Davidians were all but massacred, yeah, that doesn't paint a very good picture of the ATF or any of the agents involved. Now, the first opening salvos of this incident would occur around 9:45 a.m. when agents showed up in covered trailers and surrounded the front entrance of the Branch Davidian's compound. At this moment, Koresh would step out, with his hands up, yelling to them, and clearly stating that there were women and children inside. However, amidst all the yelling, there was a shot fired, and initially, agents would claim that the Branch Davidians were the ones who fired first. However, they would be proven to be false reports or misinformation when this claim was refuted by later reports, which would lead to many a theory suggesting that either an agent fired first after spotting David having a firearm on him, or seeing one of the men through a window holding a firearm, regardless of it being pointed towards them or not. Or even that a particular group within the ATF, referred to as the Dog Kill Team, which at this point the ATF in general is referred to as dog killers due to their actions, had been sent in advance to shoot the Branch Davidian's dogs first. And for some reason, they either used a rather poor quality suppressor, no suppressor at all, or people who have experience with firearms know what a suppressed shot sounds like, leading to the opening salvos being fired by somebody linked to the ATF, leading to the gunfight and the eventual deaths. So at this point, things are not looking good for the ATF's image. And while a significant point of contention still exists around who fires first, it is clear that David Koresh had stood outside, clearly within view of the authorities, who were quite notably armed, with his hands raised. As quickly as things started, he was shot in the stomach and his hand, which caused him to retreat quickly and hide behind the door. Later reports would suggest, but not affirm, that Koresh might have been moved to a different floor after being shot, or had remained with the main group of men to engage officers, in fear of retreating back further, potentially risking the women and children. Even the most charitable implication of this would mean that the ATF had fired upon a man who had clearly shown no signs of aggression, and more likely than not been the active instigators in the confrontation. Strangely enough, this front door, which supposedly held crucial evidence, in particular the bullets fired by the agents who had struck Koresh, would mysteriously vanish. All the while, the other door remained intact as evidence in perfect condition. According to one agent who would eventually testify, he had witnessed a group of investigators loading the right door into a different vehicle after the standoff and driving away with it. In subsequent congressional hearings, the missing door would remain a mystery. Apparently, not even Congress could get the ATF to admit anything, or find anything really. It was as if it had vanished off the face of the earth. Eventually, Wayne Martin, a Davidian member himself, would desperately reach out to the local police departments, urging them to intervene and stop the shooting. He would emphasize that they had been fired upon first, and that they were afraid due to the lives of women and children being directly in peril by the continued assault. It was noted he pleaded for clarity in the unfolding chaos. Unfortunately, things would just continue to get worse. As the initial gunfire erupted, it would become something straight out of a bad movie, where the first agents would attempt to maneuver out back. However, this agent would be shot by a gunman positioned at an upper window. Meanwhile, helicopters were abuzz in the sky, and supposedly this was a distraction maneuver, but according to the survivors, they were being fired upon from said helicopters. From here, things would completely devolve into a sheer and utter mess. Agents would scramble to gain entry, going so far as to position ladders against the building to gain access to the upper floors, where they believed most of the weapons were stored. This was according to the brave Agent Rodriguez, who had ran away, and as agents crowded into the window, they were summarily fired upon before they were able to deploy a stun grenade and force entry into this area of the building. However, this would lead to casualties resulting on both sides. Amidst this mess, one agent would fall off the roof, and another was slain on entry, and one of the Davidians who had fired upon them was fatally shot in return. In another move, when the agents attempted to aggress, they were ambushed upon yet again, resulting in even more injuries, leading them to retreating through the window itself, essentially trading lives for nothing, as they scrambled to take cover behind vehicles. All the while, the exchange of fire between the Davidians and the ATF would continue for a total of 45 minutes before general ammunition stocks were depleted, and even then, sporadic gunfire would continue for another 2 hours, prolonging this harrowing ordeal. And in what can be interpreted as a gesture of compassion, the Davidians offered to allow the ATF agents to retrieve their wounded and dead without reprisal. This was in part because on the ATF side, 4 agents had lost their lives and 16 had been injured, while on the Davidian side, 5 had been killed and several more injured. This would include Koresh himself on the list of injured. After they collected their deceased, the Davidians would go on to bury them properly in the property's own cemetery. Tragically, as they were returning from the funeral, one of them was fatally shot by an ATF agent, who had claimed that the man himself had opened fire upon him, despite being one of the ones in charge of burying the body. And although the ATF agent made this claim, it was never confirmed. So as far as the casualty count stood on the first day, it amounted to 6 dead Davidians and 4 ATF agents. This tantamount failure quickly attracted a media frenzy, and what had initially began as an ATF investigation into a group in Texas accused of weapons charges had quickly spiraled out of their control and resulted in 10 deaths, and a media circus now surrounding this ongoing event. Subsequently, this led to the FBI taking over the situation as the death of federal agents put it under their jurisdiction, leading to the FBI calling in their hostage response team, in almost the exact same manner that the debacle at Ruby Ridge had called for. They would quickly assume control. At the same time, David Koresh would reach out to local media news teams and give interviews recounting the events. In response, for some reason, the FBI cut off the phone lines, allowing negotiation only to occur through their negotiators. Unfortunately for them, despite their restricted communications, Koresh's words resonated with the media, as he asserted that they were fired upon first, which matched the reputation that the ATF and the FBI held at this time, and portrayed his actions as defensive, which, seeing how the ATF had been acting, the media had little reason to doubt, since it quite honestly matched, or strongly resembled, what had occurred in Ruby Ridge. All the while, Koresh would engage in extensive dialogues with FBI negotiators, discussing family, the Bible, and the negotiators' very own lives. The conversations ranged between everything, including personal information and philosophical discussions. And while the Davidians' compound was encircled by the FBI, the Davidians remained steadfast in their preparedness to endure until the end in a defensive manner. This would be eventually noted as a clear distinction between the Davidians' mindset and that of a typical doomsday cult, such as the one from Jonestown and Om Shinrikyo. However, regardless of this, the FBI seemed to lack tact, or even any understanding of the Davidians' beliefs and ideology, going so far as to stereotype them or claim that they were a crazy extremist religious group or cult, as they expected them to drink the Kool-Aid much like Jonestown had, or go out in a blaze of offensive glory. But as days passed, the Davidians did nothing, since rather than them being set up to be an offensive group which would go out and attack non-believers, the Davidians seemed to firmly believe that they were to wait out what they saw as a battle with Babylon, remaining inside and safe, waiting for their next move. David Koresh would go so far as to offer his surrender to the FBI if they aired a message for him to the American people. However, after the FBI had played the message, Koresh had claimed that God had told him to stay put. In particular, he had claimed that his promise was that he would come out if they aired the message, but that God had directed him otherwise, and who was he to contradict divine will? This leads us to a rather peculiar question. Did David Koresh genuinely believe he was communicating with God? Was he manipulating the situation? Or was the fact that he was shot multiple times leading to some rather strange decision making? However, the negotiation tapes, which were later publicized, reveal that either he genuinely believed that he was following divine guidance, or that this was a strategic ploy to manipulate an unwell man by the FBI. Amidst these discussions, the FBI's actions seemed to escalate tensions rather starkly, including but not limited to when they moved tanks and armored personnel carriers up to the compound, cut off the power, restricted communications, and engaged in lewd or lascivious behavior, such as mooning and flashing the women and children inside. This rather crude and disrespectful conduct understandably alarmed and infuriated the Davidians within, raising a myriad of doubts about how honest and truthful the authorities were on any of their claims towards them, painting the negotiators as liars and cheats This inappropriate behavior further strained this situation and all but scuttled further negotiations, since the FBI seemed to be rather aggressive and disrespectful. And this was not just noted by the Davidians, but by those who saw them. All in all, it seemed like federal agents wanting to play soldiers. At least, that's what many believe it was, since they were firing from helicopters, bringing in tanks, training as if they were in the military, cutting off communications, outright besieging a religious group, using tanks and APCs at their leisure, and showing both lewd and lascivious behaviors towards all those inside. Eventually, this would lead to the negotiators asking if David could send out some of the children, and David replied he'd be happy to send out anybody who didn't want to be there. So several mothers and 19 children, aged anywhere from a few months old, 12 years old, chose to leave. This left a total of 23 children still remaining inside the building, in part due to them not trusting the people flashing their kids and shooting at them. After this departure, that left a total of 98 people within the Mount Carmel facility. However, it is at this point that the FBI and the ATF lose a lot of respect for people, because quickly as the mothers came out, they were summarily separated from their children and arrested, while their children were taken in for interviews in what seems to be an attempt to portray the ATF and the FBI as some noble heroes saving the children. However, when the children were asked about the abuse, it seemed like a pretty clear-cut case that there was some abuse between Koresh and their parents, at least claimed by the FBI, who for some reason, even though they're claiming this, made no records of this, made no records of the children claiming it, other than later claims by them. And you'd think that would be something that they would record, or at least jot down at the time. But no, we just have a FBI agent saying, oh no, yeah, they abused them. And according to witnesses who would later testify, the federal agencies actually had no evidence of child abuse. And this was just a narrative from the ATF and the FBI to paint themselves in a good light, which seemed to be based on Koresh being creepy towards young women who at the time of his actions were legally considered young women in the state which he resided in, to allegations of outright abuse with no evidence. And it was noted that the interrogators had been using leading questions in order to elicit vague statements that would paint the narrative they would need. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough for them to outright report anything officially. However, even while injured, David seemed to be able to use the situation to his advantage by insisting that video footage of himself and his followers be shown to those outside, wanting to show them who they really were, and who the FBI and the ATF had been besieging. So in the 9th day, the FBI would send in a camera, and the Davidians would set off to record. But it seemed that the three-letter agencies wanted to bring out the even bigger guns and flex their muscles, and them bringing tanks in and heavy equipment really painted them in a bad light to the media and the public at large. That added on to some of the recordings of Koresh stating things like, now those two agents across the streets, Robert Gonzalez, I love the guy, I was honest with him, I brought him into my home. He was going to stay for 2 weeks. But all this stuff you may want to avoid and deny. He wanted to look around, and I promised him a tour. He could have talked to anyone here. He was free to come and go as he chose, but I do not appreciate it, and I never will. I do not appreciate someone coming here with 2 helicopters, cattle trailers, and pushing people around. My guns say I'll meet you at the doorstep any day. Somebody's gonna get hurt if you want to keep playing that game. This ain't America when the ATF has that kind of power to come into anybody's home, kick doors down, and things like that. I do understand. Someone reminded me that one of the officers said his gun went off accidentally, and that just like that, signal and all that. But look, besides the point, the ATF, you boys are wrong. Your practices, your habits, fine for drug dealers, but even if there is a question whatsoever, if kids and women are involved, damn you, keep your damn gun in your holster. Let them ask questions first, but no one's going to expect me, when they come busting in my door with guns drawn and pointed in the air and someone firing at me, that I'm going to lay down and die for anybody. That's not happening in this country. See this here? This is my family. It may not be like your family, but this one here is my family too. So you guys do it your way and I'll do it my way. Don't argue with me. Catch me on the side of the road somewhere. I'll meet you at my door anytime. And I'm sorry some of your guys got shot. But hey, God will have to sort that out. After these statements and many others, the FBI would choose not to follow with their deal and release the video the Davidians had provided because they felt it would garner public support for the Davidians. Within a week and a half, there had been no progress, and infighting began to arise within the FBI. The negotiators had stated that they were making progress by talking to David and others, but the hostage response team had said that things were going too slow and they needed to be sped up. So the HRT started to outright use psychological warfare. They began by taking tanks and armored vehicles and using them to run over the Davidians' parked cars out in the front. Then, throughout the night, they would shine spotlights at the building and play disturbing noises on loudspeakers, much like what had been done to the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. These were variations of old music mixed with sounds of rabbits and other animals being slaughtered. There are some who state that they even played dolphin noises. Eventually, there would be some exchanges between officials and the public, asking about the psychological warfare, but individuals who were press-facing would state that they did not seem to know what it was about, neither confirming nor denying any statements or reports. On the 7th day, reporters would spot a banner which stated, "God help us, we want the press." In response, reporters would go on to make statements of their own. All the while, the government officials were running over cars and other properties, in particular, desecrating the bodies of the Davidians who had been previously buried. They just kept going back and forth, flagrantly desecrating the bodies in a manner completely unbefitting any sort of law enforcement authority. And even if you believe that the government was in the right by attempting to detain Koresh and break up the Branch Davidians, what was the point in desecrating the bodies? At that point, you're just being disrespectful and animalistic, proving the Davidians right that they have no reason to trust you. This has led many to question if the FBI wanted to push David Koresh and the Branch Davidians to their limit and force their hands into attacking, which would give them the go-ahead to essentially slaughter some short of 100 individuals in one fell swoop. It would be to the point that some Davidians would ask, did they want to create an incident, make us come out crazy and start shooting? So they would have the excuse to gun us down. We didn't know. We realized they had the ability, and it was beneath them to erase all evidence. And the Davidians pointed to the fact that the federal agencies had cut off the power and communications, along with water lines. But it must be noted that the Branch Davidians did have water tanks within the property in order to ensure that they could survive most anything. However, 2 of them had been damaged and drained during the initial shootout. Unfortunately, this would leave the entire compound relying on a singular tank of water. Near the latter end of the siege, around 11 more people had left the compound. However, unfortunately, several children had chosen to stay behind because they had witnessed their parents being immediately arrested and them being taken separately. Consequently, the actions of the ATF and FBI had made the children feel safer with the Branch Davidians within the compound. During the latter part of the siege, the FBI seemed to be in a near panic, bringing in religious experts and cult experts to attempt to better understand the psychology of those inside the compound. Meanwhile, what was occurring outside Mount Carmel seemed to be completely spiraling out of the ATF and FBI's control, as people were gathering in large numbers, selling t-shirts, ice creams, sodas, waters, souvenirs, and a myriad of other things, to the point the atmosphere seemed almost to mirror that of a small carnival. And it was at this point that the FBI decided to push the press back from the compound, allowing them close enough to see the compound, but not hear or witness the actions taken on by their agents, which escalated things and further spiraled everything out of control. The FBI hostage rescue team seemed to be almost itching for action, as they began to enact their next steps. Then, on April 10th, there were disturbing suggestions by agents saying that they should just bring snipers in to take out Koresh while he was speaking with negotiators, call him to the window and just shoot him. This proposal seemed to be just what was done at Ruby Ridge, which slayed an innocent woman and endangered multiple children. It seemed that the ATF and FBI at this point were trigger happy. However, cooler heads remained in control, and the idea was quashed in fears of Koresh's death by such underhanded tactics, potentially triggering a mass self-termination by the Davidians, which further showed how disconnected and how uninformed the agents making the decisions and acting upon them were from the beliefs of the Davidians. All the while, pressure was mounting to an incredible degree from DC and from the real chambers of power to resolve this situation quickly. Things going so far as to a live call-in show being aired, kind of like a PBS fundraiser where multiple people called in asking for the feds to take decisive action, when attitudes like that had been what had led to this debacle and the Ruby Ridge debacle. Eventually, Attorney General Janet Reno would convey to President Clinton that the situation was rapidly deteriorating. However, while Clinton initially questioned why they couldn't wait, Attorney General Janet Reno would argue vehemently that waiting would be too costly. She would go on to state that there were concerns that other militias might rally to support the Davidians, potentially escalating things further. This would eventually lead to a green light being given to the authorities to end things. On April 14th, David had announced that he had received his final message from God, in which he requested to write down his interpretation of the 7 seals of Revelation before surrendering, and having the manuscript shared with the media. And apparently the letter included a message where he reassured the authorities and the media that he had told everyone inside that they did not have to die now, that the prophecies were not being fulfilled, and that he believed that the situation could still be resolved peacefully. However, the hostage rescue team didn't like this, not one bit. It wasn't enough for them. They were eager to take action and decided to act, feeling that the negotiations had reached a dead end. Later, during House hearings, the FBI testified that the negotiations had stalled and that Koresh had not been cooperating. However, their own negotiators had indeed reached an agreement, sending in several typewriter ribbons as proof that Koresh was indeed working on what he had promised he was doing, aka the seals. Yet on April 19th, 1993, the FBI would commence a second attack, this time starting with launching gas canisters from tanks at the compound. Several other armored, basically military vehicles, would surround the compound and punch holes in the walls. After 51 days, the FBI had claimed that this was their last opportunity to surrender, all the while assaulting the compound in the most aggressive way possible. And they began to pump out tear gas. And as the gas filled the compound, the women and children would go down into the bunker, seeking safety, knowing that the gas mask would not properly fit the children. Meanwhile, some of the men still in the building donned the gas mask they could and began to fire upon the tank. Others would wave a white flag and request phone repairs, signaling a desire for surrender, since it was later shown that the bunker's entrance and the tunnels where this supposedly happened had been destroyed by the very tanks, leaving those inside, in essence, vulnerable, in an indefensible position. It seems the FBI would later reveal that they had planted listening devices within the facility and had heard the men yelling, praying, and what they claim was preparing Molotov cocktails to defend against the gas attack. Essentially, they had gone trigger happy and the situation had escalated out of control. And around noon, magically the building would erupt in flames, as fire spread rapidly and consumed most of the structure as if there had been an accelerant poured everywhere. And as the building burned, many attempted to escape. However, only 9 managed to make it out alive. These were the final survivors of the Branch Davidians. To further muddy the waters up, fire trucks rushing onto the scene were stopped by FBI agents who feared they might be fired upon by people who were surrendering and were in a literal blazing inferno. Consequently, the building would burn down to the ground, and the bodies, which would eventually be recovered, were charred and barely recognizable as humans. Many of the men were found in positions that suggested they were attempting to free the women and children from the bunker the tanks had carelessly trapped them in. And those within the bunker who were not burned, particularly women and children, seemed to have passed due to a combination of suffocation and being poisoned from the gas that had been launched being burned. Several victims who had been burned alive also had gunshot wounds, which are considered by most to be attempted acts of mercy, because rather than being burned alive, or slowly suffocating to death and being poisoned, a shot to the head was a quick way out. One survivor would be noted as emerging from the flames, clutching the burning transcripts of David Koresh's writings, indicating that he had indeed been fulfilling his promise. And as it showed, it seemed that he had intended for everyone to leave the compound safely before this final assault. Now, David Koresh had been found shot, allegedly by his assistant, who had self-terminated. Reportedly, this act was a last resort to spare themselves from the agonizing effects of the gas and the fire. There are various interpretations currently abound, including some that state that the idea to use a sniper to take them out was enacted just as soon as the final assault happened. In the aftermath of the tragic events, the initial reaction wasn't one of temperance, remorse, or even guilt, but rather, the ATF in particular began taking pictures signaling what they seemed to see as a military victory. This is a shift in symbolism, which many would later see as speaking volumes to the true intent of the Waco siege. And it seems a lawyer representing David Koresh's grandmother had attempted to engage with the authorities on site. However, he would go on to state that the response he received was cold and non-cooperative, and that it was evidence that those in charge had no intention of sharing information, cooperating, and that their demeanor exuded unbridled hostility, as their words revealed a disturbingly aggressive mindset, one driven by a desire for vengeance. Many would go on to state that while these were seasoned officers with years of experience under their belts, their actions reflected an appalling disregard for the sanctity of human life, and many would go on to question the morality of their actions. It would also be noted that the FBI would engage in grotesque displays, posing with rifles over the bodies of the innocent slain children, and even noting that tampering of evidence occurred, the inclusion of the removal of the door being one of these incidents, along with a myriad of other pieces from the compound which mysteriously vanished. Regardless of the assertions of the State Department, many claim that there is ample reason to doubt the Davidians intentionally set fire upon their own facility, in particular when the government attempted to claim both that they were making Molotov cocktails and that the phrase, "let it when the tank gets here," was what led to the self-termination, when the context is much more likely that they were intending to use the Molotov cocktails that the FBI had claimed that they had against the tanks. However, despite a lack of evidence to support the claims of the government, the narrative of the Branch Davidians being another deranged cult like Jonestown was perpetuated. Moreover, questions were raised about if it was an intended self-termination, why were attempts to wear gas masks and multiple individuals attempting to escape made, along with why were the bodies of men found attempting to free the women and children in the bunker in such positions if it was a voluntary mass self-termination. The later testimony of the 9 survivors further supports this point of view, as they described it as a scene of panic and survival instincts kicking in, not a premeditated act of self-termination. Even before the fire began, the FBI had been noted to be making unsettling remarks that hinted at an awareness of the impending fire. For instance, they would inquire shortly before the final act of the siege if the Davidians had fire extinguishers, and upon learning that there was only one, the negotiators were stated to have quipped, "somebody ought to buy some fire insurance," suggesting a disturbing indifference, if not a potential intent to set the place ablaze. During the subsequent trial, a major point of contention was the use of CS gas. While state-appointed experts would claim it wasn't flammable, reality would not match these claims. When combined with methyl chloride as an aerosol, this gas becomes exceedingly flammable, and despite efforts to downplay it, the truth about this emerged. There's also the FBI's denial of firing shots or using anything involving fire during the siege being debunked, as records would show thermal imagery eventually depicted automatic gunfire and some form of pyrotechnics being deployed from the aggressing side. Even more damning, 40mm grenade casings were found on scene. This would directly contradict the FBI's claims of there being no shots or pyrotechnics involved, and no military involvement in this act. It was found out that this was a pyrotechnic projectile. Further questions would be asked, such as if the government believed that the Davidians were a dangerous doomsday cult, why were the HR teams so insistent upon escalating matters, especially by pumping in a flammable tear gas. Eventually, their desire and attempts to use gas to force the children and the elderly out would eventually be condemned. And sadly, on that tragic day, 82 people would lose their lives, including 23 children. In the aftermath of everything, 12 survivors would face charges relating to aiding and abetting in the murder of federal agents, as well as possessing and/or manufacturing illegal weapons. 4 would be acquitted, while 8 of them would receive charges for using a weapon during an illegal act. By July 2007, all of them would be released. In audio tapes which would surface shortly after the incident, David Koresh was heard requesting for 2 more weeks to complete his final revelations before leaving the compound. However, the ATF would only acquiesce to 3 more days. Now, in the aftermath of the Waco siege, there was a political firestorm. And while some staunchly would defend the ATF and FBI's actions, others would demand a complete overhaul of the government. And many would question why crucial evidence would seem to vanish, including the telephone logs from April 17th to the 19th in particular, which even the ones found were heavily redacted. Another rather pressing concern was the quick destruction of the property and all buildings thereof. In coincidental serendipity for the government, Lionel Haruchi, the sniper who shot at Vicky Weaver at Ruby Ridge, was just coincidentally stationed at the siege during the final day, the day that no shots were officially fired upon the Davidians. However, many allege that evidence suggests otherwise, going so far as alleging that Haruchi fired shots at people trying to flee, stating that he had quickly rebarreled his rifle, making it impossible for any of the shots to trace back to him. However, as the years would go on and more information would be shown, as previously mentioned, and stories would surface about the use of pyrotechnics and information about the mysterious disappearance of the compound's door, and questions about the complete destruction of the compound would arise, it would lead to a rather negative view of these agencies. Despite these revelations, many within the government seem to see Waco as a triumph. Unfortunately, tragedies are like dominoes, and at times they will cause others. This was no exception. Individuals such as Timothy McVeigh would cite Ruby Ridge and the Waco siege as the primary motivations for his actions. Both sides did definitely entrench themselves, but could anything have been done to avoid such a tragedy? In conclusion, while the events at Waco serve as a chilling reminder to the complexities and consequences inherent in manners of justice, authority, and belief, we should not falter in our pursuit of truth and accountability. With each unanswered question that remains, we are reminded of the importance of transparency on all sides, and we are reminded of the importance of compassion, even in the face of adversity, even when someone might anger and slight us beyond the pale. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.